without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Paige Gibbons-Backus. Paige is a University of Mary Washington graduate, which is down in Fredericksburg. She's also has a master's from George Mason University, and she works in Northern Virginia. But tonight she's representing Emerging Civil War. Emerging Civil War is a blog on the internet started by myself, Chris Mikowski, and our friend Jake Struhelka now 10 years ago. So it's a conglomeration of all kinds of authors, topics. So head over to emergingcivilwar.com to check out more from Paige and all of the other authors in the stable there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paige Gibbons-Backus to talk to us about medical care during the Civil War. Paige?
All right, thank you so much, Chris. And as we go throughout our presentation today, I have a PowerPoint that hopefully you all will be able to see. And so if you have any questions or anything as we go throughout the presentation, Chris is going to interrupt and ask those questions so that way we can have a little bit of more of a discussion rather than that I just talk to you for the next straight hour. But over the next hour, we are going to be learning a little bit about what I like to call another war that was happening over the course of the American Civil War. And that was essentially a war against life and death in the chaos and the carnage of the medical field during the Civil War. And the reason for that is before the Civil War began, the medical field was advanced for its time, but it is nowhere near the medical field that we experience today. And the reason for that is because of the American Civil War. And over the course of the war, in just 4 years' time, you have now over 700,000 casualties. And with so many casualties occurring in such a short amount of time, at the beginning of the war, the medical field was unprepared. They were not ready for the carnage that they were going to experience. And so it really propelled into the medical field that we take advantage today. And so to start a little bit, before we get into the American Civil War, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of the state of the medical field in the 19th century before 1860. And so by 1860, the medical field, it was advanced for its time. However, it, like I said, was nowhere near the medical field that it is today. And the reason for that is because by this point in the 19th century, you have several thoughts and several theories that were already becoming out of date by this point in time. And one of those is the Humerus Theory that has been seen a lot throughout the colonial period. And you'll see that in a lot of the medical texts, in which there are 4 humors in the body, of which you can see here in the Hippocratic method, in which there is blood, bile, phlegm, and black bile. And when those are out of balance, that's what makes you sick. And so if you have too much blood, you have a fever, and they will bleed you with leeches to try and reduce the blood and help balance that up. If you have too much phlegm, you had water in your lungs, so they would try to drain the fluid. If you had too much yellow bile, that might mean you are hot, you have cholera, and so one of the treatments for that is to actually do what's called blistering and create a blister, cut that blister, and let the pus release itself, and that would balance the humors. And that is really becoming out of date by this point in time. And so we are already starting to kind of progress a little bit into the modern medical era. But still, in the 1800s, you have doctors, you have physicians who are considered trained medical professionals, yet some of these doctors actually hadn't had any medical experience at all in hands-on training. There were many medical schools that had been around since the colonial era and in the turn of the 1800s. However, many of these schools are in Europe. The schools that would start to develop in Philadelphia, Boston, and there are some throughout the South, would not come around until the 19th century. And many medical schools, such as you see here in the Paris Clinical School, you actually don't have to have any clinicals or any hands-on experience to become a trained physician. You might be observing and you might be learning a little bit about anatomy from the few cadavers that are available. However, there there are certain laws that really severely restrict the number of cadavers that are available for anatomical study. And so really it's limited to people who were homeless, people who were poor, people who would typically be buried in potter's fields. And so there were very few opportunities to advance the medical field throughout the 19th century. And so we really wouldn't see much of this until the American Civil War. And we really wouldn't see just how unprepared people were and how unprepared the state of the medical field was until the Battle of First Manassas. And so what many thought was going to be a one battle war would actually turn into 4 years of war. But because so many people had thought that here at the Battle of First Manassas, this was going to be one of the biggest, one of the only major engagements of the American Civil War that would decide the fate of the war, really illustrated just how unprepared the medical field was. And so, for example, with all of the troops that were converging on the battlefield at First Manassas on July 21st, 1861, you had about 36,000 troops, 18,000 Union troops, 18,000 Confederate troops. And when these soldiers first converged on the field, they are coming from anywhere between 4 and 8 miles away. They're coming from Centerville in the case of the Northern Army, or they're coming from the Manassas Junction, which is 4 miles to the south. And so when the armies converge and the battle begins on the morning of the 21st, there are no hospitals established there along the front lines. They have few supplies available, they have some tents available, and they're ready with little pieces of documentation that they have to record the soldiers who are wounded that day. And for example, Dr. Magruder, who is the chief medical officer on the Northern Army at this point in time at First Manassas, he tries to keep record as the soldiers fall on that morning, but he quickly realizes that he cannot keep up with the number of wounded that are coming in. And he realizes the situation that he's in. He doesn't have any hospital set up, to which he'll start establishing hospitals at Sudley Springs. And it's the same thing for the Confederate Army as well, following those battle lines and following those routes that the soldiers took to get to the Battle of First Manassas. And so as we go throughout our presentation today, typically what I like to do when doing an overview of the medical field over the course of of the Civil War, I will pull examples of different events that pertain to the examples that I'm going to be illustrating today based on the location that I am. And so for the virtual presentation today, because it's virtual, I'm going to be pulling examples from all over the place, all throughout the war, to really illustrate some of these different challenges that the Civil War would really create that would propel the medical field into the field that a lot of us actually take for granted today. And so over the course of the Battle of First Manassas, you have, like I said, you had no hospital set up the morning of the battle. In addition to this, there were very few staff members, very few trained medical personnel who had actually had proper hands-on experience prior to the Battle of First Manassas there on the field. When the Civil War began, the medical departments for both the Confederate and Union armies had 2 medical personnel for each regiment, an assistant surgeon and a surgeon. And that could be 2 people, 2 medical officers for every about 1,000 people. But by the day's end, in less than 24 hours, there were about 3,500 soldiers who were wounded and missing. And so the ratio of medical personnel available to treat these soldiers and the spaces available for people to be treated was very low and not to what it should have been. And so over the course of the Battle of First Manassas, we actually have some examples of soldiers who would actually remark on this because it left such an impact on them. And one soldier from the 5th Virginia Infantry named John Opie actually remarked one scene at a hospital called Portici, which is just south of the southern battle lines, which he said there were piles of legs, feet, hands, arms, all thrown together and at a distance resembled piles of corn at a corn shucking. Many of the feet still retained a boot or a shoe. Wounded men were lying on tables, and surgeons, some of whom at the time were very unskillful, were carving away like farmers in butchering season, while the poor devils under the knife yelled with pain. Many limbs were lost that should have been saved, and many lives were lost in trying to save the limbs that should have been amputated. And so you would find this not only on the southern hospitals at First Manassas, you would find this in the northern hospitals as well. One hospital, known now as the famous Stone House, was very rarely used as, or barely used, I should say, as a hospital during First Manassas. It was right in the middle of the battle lines, and so it wasn't able to be turned into an efficient hospital, but more of a place for soldiers to seek shelter. And the Union soldiers that were left there were come across by a group of Confederate soldiers, and they remark, in this building were 32 wounded, many of them dreadfully mangled by cannon shot. There was but a single surgeon, and he was young and apparently inefficient. Men lay on the floor with their clotted wounds, still undressed, and some had died and not been removed. And so you can see just from the inexperience of some of these surgeons, this is their first experience with combat. This is their first experience with gunshot wounds, let alone amputations and severe trauma. And so some of these surgeons are unskilled and are unsure of themselves and what they need to do. And so you had some surgeons who were making mistakes that would cost lives. You had some surgeons that would make mistakes that would actually save lives. And in addition to this, being the first battle of the Civil War, the medical field at this point in time was very much still divided between North and South. It was not yet a fight for life or death. And so in hospitals such as the hospital that you see here at Sudley Church, you can see where these hospital lines were incredibly divided. And so by the end of the day, at the Battle of First Manassas, the Confederates had won the battle, and this created a rout for the Union Army. Many of the Union soldiers were trying to make their way back to Centerville the only way that they knew how, which was the way that they came, 8 miles out of their way. And so surgeons were left with a decision. Should they stay? Should they try and treat their soldiers? Or should they leave? And some of those surgeons actually decided to leave. One surgeon of the 11th Massachusetts actually left a soldier on the operating table and ran when he heard that the Confederate soldiers were coming. Others decided to stay, and they were actually captured as prisoners of war, taken away from those hospitals and sent down to Richmond to the prisoner of war camps. And as a result of that, those Union surgeons who were treating Union soldiers were now pulled away, leaving those Union soldiers to be treated by Confederate surgeons when they already had too many wounded to deal with on their own. And this actually cost a great deal of life because these Union soldiers had to wait much longer than what they should had to receive medical care. And that actually had a direct result over the course of the Civil War within a year when Dr. Hunter McGuire, who was the chief surgeon of Jackson's Corps, actually entered into an agreement in May of 1862 with a few Union surgeons when he was actually captured. And his agreement that they came into actually says, we surgeons and assistant surgeons of the United States, or excuse me, it was the opposite way around. We surgeons and assistant surgeons of the United States Army, now prisoners of war in this place, do give our parole of honor on being unconditionally released in report in person, in singly or collectively to the Secretary of War in Washington City, and as such that we will use our best efforts to return the same number of medical officers in the Confederate States Army, now prisoners of war. And so as a result of this agreement between Dr. Hunter McGuire and these Union medical officers who actually did go to Edwin Stanton, he actually very quickly passed what's called Special Order Number 60, in which he immediately and unconditionally freed all Confederate doctors held prisoner and expected to the same. And so this essentially shifted this fight between life and death to just that, and a neutral war, a war that it didn't matter where these soldiers came from, didn't matter which side they fought for. if anyone was wounded, whoever was around would try to do the best that they could to try and save their life. And this would become increasingly important because over the course of the war, over the course of First Manassas, you had 3,500 troops who were wounded in a single day. Those numbers over the course of the war would only increase. And this creates a whole new set of challenges, and it really compounds all of these problems that the medical field are facing in terms of supplies, medical personnel available, beds, as well as the environment itself, creating a situation in which disease is spreading throughout these hospitals, actually making the fight between life and death, these hospitals that these soldiers are being treated in, a much more dangerous place, in fact, than on the battlefield itself. And so,
Hey,
for
Paige.
example, yes.
All right. So I think I found a way to break in with a question for you.
Awesome. Go ahead.
Okay. So how prevalent was it for amputations to be done without any anesthetic other than alcohol? I'm wondering if they're liquoring up the surgeon or the patient. For those, why didn't they get either, which was known in the U.S. by 1846?
That is a very good question. And that's actually a myth that we talk about a lot. There are actually very few instances in which amputations and most medical treatments are done without the use of anesthesia. You're right, you do have chloroform, you do have ether, you do have a lot of different chemicals that are around by this point in time. But over the course of the war, the supplies of these materials just becomes much more difficult to acquire. And so it's not until the end of the war, it's not until siege situations, for example, in which these operations need to be completed without the use of anesthesia. Now, for a lot of these soldiers who didn't have, or surgeons, excuse me, who didn't have a lot of medical experience, that does create another challenge that I will side note to, because you have chemicals such as ether, for example, which is a very flammable material. And so it's an effective material as well. But you have cases of surgeons who are giving too much anesthesia to patients in which it accidentally kills some of these soldiers. You have a few cases where surgeons are operating in the middle of the night next to the ether that they just administered, which is flammable, and it causes the area to blow up and start a flame. And so you do have a lot of learning that's taking place with the result of the use of these chemicals. But that's a really good question. And that is a common myth that you'll find over the course of the Civil War. And you can see from the graph here, actually from the American Battlefield Trust, that as you progress throughout the war, the number of casualties that the medical field has to deal with and has to treat just only increases. And as the number of soldiers that are being wounded increases, a lot of the times what happens is that the supplies that are available decrease, creating significant challenges for the medical field. And so, for example, during the Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862, you have over 17,000 people who are wounded the day of. Fredericksburg, 13,000 wounded the day of. Gettysburg, 33,000 the day of. And so, with Antietam being the single bloodiest day of the war, there's actually a few accounts that we will pull for the purpose of this discussion, in which Sergeant Jacob Freiberger of the Company K 51st Infantry actually remarks, "I have seen more than I have ever expected to see. I have laid on the field in front of the enemy where the dead and wounded were lying in heaps around us." And in the days following the Battle of Antietam, a reporter from the New York Tribune actually wrote, "The wounded are coming in by the thousands. Around us and in a large barn, I counted 1,200 wounded. Along the same road and within the distance of 2 miles are more than 3 hospitals, each having 600 to 700 people in them, and long trains of ambulances standing in the road waiting to discharge their bloody loads. Surgeons with hands, arms, garments covered with blood are busy amputating limbs, extracting balls, and bandaging wounds of every nature in every part of the body." And it was the same thing that would be experienced in Gettysburg as well. Following the 3 days of Gettysburg in July of 1863, the entire town resembled a hospital. July 15th, 1863, another reporter from the Philadelphia Public Ledger actually wrote that this town and the vicinity of the space within the country surrounding it, about 8 or 10 miles, is literally one vast and overcrowded hospital. In the town itself, every available space has been freely given up by the citizens to the sufferers, and yet on this, the 9th day after the battle, several thousands are lying with arms and legs amputated, and every other kind of conceivable wound in tents, in open fields, in woods, in stables, barns, and some of them even on the bare ground without cover or shelter. And this creates another challenge that the medical officers had to really deal with and try to overcome in an effort to try and save as many lives as possible. And that was the weather. For these soldiers who are out in tents or who are in the woods, in the stables, or in the bare ground, are outside with little temperature control like we are used to in today's hospitals. And so the weather had a severe impact on whether or not these soldiers lived or died. And weather actually had such an impact on these soldiers that it's actually one of the most recorded events, or one of the most recorded topics in letters of soldiers and civilians that you'll read about when learning about primary resources. And so over the course of the American Civil War, the weather actually created a lot of challenges that surgeons had to deal with in order to try and save as many lives as possible. And one of these instances that is actually the most severe, in my opinion, is actually the rain and the snow. And you wouldn't necessarily think rain would be quite such of a big deal, but if you get wet, you get cold, that causes pneumonia, and that impacts your ability to be able to survive. And for some of these soldiers who are wounded and who are weak and who are lying actually on the bare ground, sometimes didn't have the availability to get up and actually were threatened with drowning. And that actually happened a couple of times in Gettysburg, for example, and in Fredericksburg as well. And so one soldier after the Battle of Gettysburg actually remarks in one of their letters, during a day of violent thunder gusts accompanied with high winds and heavy rains on yesterday, Sunday, July 5th, some would have drowned had not the most extraordinary efforts had been put forth to prevent it. And in addition to this, in December of 1862, after the Battle of Fredericksburg, one Delaware soldier actually remarked that the rain, hail, and snow all day, and it proceeded far into the night. And 2 days later, he said that December 6th to 7th to be one of the coldest that I had experienced since I joined the Army. 3 men were frozen to death. And shortly after that, on December 16th, there was another rainstorm that hit the hospitals in Fredericksburg, in which he remarked water flowed into the tents and soaked the hay on which the wounded lay. And so for these soldiers who are out in the field, in these hospitals, are really threatened over the course of the war with these different elements of weather. And so not only is it these soldiers who face this hazard out in the field, one of the more common groups of people to really experience these hazards was prisoners of war. And so not only do you have to fear the cold and do you have to fear the wet, you have to fear the heat as well. And many of you may be able to recognize this image that you see here. This is an image of Andersonville. And so in Andersonville, you have thousands of men, many of us know the story, that are crammed into a small space surrounded by a picket line where, due to supply, there is little food, little shelter, little clothing, and the sanitary conditions are just horrible. And many of these men are exposed to the elements, so much so that soldiers are dying actually from heat exhaustion. Soldiers are dying from starvation. They're also dying from disease as well, with the poor sanitation methods, especially washing through the creek that's going right through the middle of camp. And so one soldier, Samuel J. Gibson of the 103rd Pennsylvania Infantry, actually remarked about Andersonville, referring to it as being hell upon earth. He writes, "Our condition is daily growing more disagreeable as the weather grows warmer. 3 out of 4 of the men in my mess are sick. If this is not hell itself, it must be pandemonium, which is only hell gate. Heaven forbid I should ever see a worse place." And so many of us have heard of Gettysburg before or read a little bit about Gettysburg, but one of the lesser known prisoner of war camps that actually is just as notorious is actually up in New York, known as Elmira, or to some of the soldiers who were there, Hellmira. And the difference between Georgia and the difference between New York is that in the middle of the winter in New York, the temperatures are much, much lower, creating much more of a hazard for these soldiers who are actually imprisoned, many of them outside in a similar situation to the soldiers at Gettysburg. And so you had about 5,100 soldiers who were camped outdoors in the tents that you see here in this image, while about 38 were housed in only 30 barracks. And by the onset of winter, they were without floors, without blankets in many of these tents, and they were running out of supplies. And one soldier, actually from Texas, remarks that if there was ever a hell on earth, Elmira prison was that hell, but it was not a hot one. Another soldier remembered that the weather was an average of about 10 to 15 degrees below zero. And there were about 100 men trying to keep warm by the stove. Every morning they crawled out of their bunks, shivering and half frozen, when a scuffle and frequently a fight for a place by the fire occurred. God help the sick and the weak, as they were literally left out in the cold. And so we think about the conditions that a lot of these soldiers are forced to endure in these prisoner of war camps. And many of us might think why these conditions are so bad. And one of the reasons for this is that over the course of the Civil War, as the years progress, the availability of supplies for not just these prisoners of war, but men out in the field are becoming harder and harder to acquire. By 1862, for example, here in Northern Virginia, where I am, a lot of the trees were already cut down. And so a lot of the fuel for firewood, a lot of the availability to build winter quarters and things of that nature was already gone. And so armies were resorting to tearing down buildings to use those materials to burn to keep warm and to provide shelter. And it was the same thing in a lot of these prisoner of war camps and throughout both the Western and the Eastern theater as well. And so over the course of the war, you will actually have people who will be remarking on some of these shortness of supplies. And here you can see some of the different winter quarters that were built at Elmira, but again, there were only about 30 of them. And so, and you may recognize this image here. I apologize if it's a little graphic, that just shows the impact of these soldiers and not having that availability to access food, to access shelter, and for many of these soldiers to access medical supplies. This is actually a soldier who had been imprisoned at Andersonville. And many of you may have seen, there are several images of some of these soldiers who were documented after the end of the Civil War and after Andersonville was closed down. And a lot of these soldiers were experiencing conditions like this all throughout the United States. And one observer in the Christian Commission, whose role it was to try and help get food, get supplies to these hospitals and help try provide sanitary conditions, actually remembered a hospital along Rock Creek. And they reflected the state of the hospitals throughout town. And they write, "The men here were in terrible condition. They lay upon the damp ground, many of them with nothing under them. In this hospital, there were an unusually large number of amputations. The amputated stumps lying directly on the ground, except when now and then they were elevated a little above a handful of straw or a bunch of old rags. Many of these men, perhaps most of them, were in want of clothing. Suitable food was not to be had. The surgeons were overworked. There was an insufficient number of attendants. Nearby were nearly quite 1,000 rebels, most of them severely wounded, shrieking and crying for assistance, continuously. Destitute of clothing, many of them were nearly naked and covered with filth, without tents, lying in the mud, cursing, praying, begging their attendants or visitors to put an end to their suffering. And so because of the conditions that some of these soldiers were forced to endure, there was actually a critical point to where soldiers would either get sick and not be able to overcome their wounds, or they would cross that critical point and miraculously start to recover. And one soldier from the 47th North Carolina actually talks about this point, and he writes, "Each day we become weaker and thinner until a certain point is reached. Then, if our wounds were curable, nature began to revive the wasted frame. If they were not, a little struggle, a low moan, and the poor emaciated skeleton of once a man was wrapped in a blanket and borne from our sight forever." And so you have, in these conditions, soldiers who are forced to really limit the amount of food that they're used to, really limit the nutrition that they are able to have in order to try and help their bodies heal. And so the odds are really struck against these soldiers, and it's really up to their constitution, and it's really up to a little bit of help from wherever to try and overcome these wounds. And it doesn't help the fact that with a lot of these soldiers who are placed in these prisoner of war camps or in these field hospitals so tightly together, with little knowledge of sanitation, little knowledge of where germs come from, that disease just spreads rampantly throughout these hospitals. Like I said, making these hospitals actually more dangerous than being out on the battlefields themselves. 2/3 of soldiers who died over the course of the American Civil War were actually killed because of disease and infection, then from the battle wounds themselves. And there are a couple of different reasons for this. And one of the biggest reasons at the onstart of the Civil War is that you have thousands of soldiers that are coming together from all walks of life and from all areas of the United States. And so for some of these soldiers, they're coming from cities. Some of these soldiers are coming from countries, rural areas. You have some areas that might have been hit with diseases such as measles or smallpox. You might have some areas that are so rural that they've never been hit with these diseases. And so there are different levels of immunity. There are different levels of illnesses that these soldiers are bringing with them. And so when you bring all of these soldiers together from all walks of life, diseases almost immediately start spreading throughout the hospitals. And that is really seen throughout the fall and throughout the winter of 1861 into 1862. So the image that you all see here is actually an image of the winter camps in Centerville, Virginia, where the Union Army actually would stay throughout that first winter of the war. In addition to this, you have hospitals and you have areas that really are all set up throughout the Manassas Junction that are almost in a sense divided between different areas to try and help keep these diseases maintained. So for example, in the small town of Brentsville, which was the county seat of Prince William County, Hampton's Legions actually had a measles hospital there. Just down the road, you have Camp Jones, where you had a lot of soldiers from Alabama and Mississippi and Texas that were all joined together. And then you have these soldiers who are here in Centerville. And so almost immediately at the beginning of the war, you have diseases such as dysentery, you have malaria and yellow fever caused by mosquitoes. You have measles, which creates a cough, a fever, a runny nose, as well as smallpox that are running rampant throughout these hospitals. One of the most common diseases that you would find through one of these hospitals is known as camp fever, more commonly known as typhoid. And it creates headaches, stomach pains, it creates a rash, spots all throughout the body that actually becomes one of the most fearful and one of the most deadly diseases over the course of these camps throughout the Civil War. And approximately about 36%, so almost 40% of these soldiers who would get typhoid fever over the course of the Civil War actually died as a result of it. And it caused a quarter of those disease deaths that would result by the end of the American Civil War. And so it didn't take long for the medical officers to actually start realizing that these poor sanitary conditions, it might be the lack of proper diet, and they started putting connections together as to what might have caused diseases. And you would really start to see that shift because prior to the American Civil War, there really wasn't much bacteriology. They really didn't know what caused a lot of these diseases. There wasn't really much of a way to study it because, again, if someone dies of typhoid fever, for example, they would be able to do an autopsy over the course of the Civil War to figure out how it affected the body. But you didn't have that before the American Civil War. And so because you had so many of these soldiers who were getting sick, it actually allowed the medical personnel to actually start making connections, to actually start drawing conclusions into what caused diseases and how to best treat them. And so one of the ways to actually treat malaria and to help treat yellow fever is actually quinine. We still use quinine today. You all might be able to recognize it at what gives your tonic water that peculiar taste. But quinine actually was really effective in helping yellow fever and helping to prevent malaria. So they actually started putting quinine in some of the rations that would have been given to these soldiers. Now, quinine doesn't really taste good when you drink it by itself, so they would put it in something like rum or whiskey to entice these soldiers to take it. But once they started giving these soldiers quinine, they started to see that the rate of yellow fever and the rate of malaria actually started to decline. And so that just goes to show one of the various successes that you would find over the course of the. And the Civil War does have a silver lining. You have close to 700,000 deaths as a result of the American Civil War. But with so many diseases, with so many of these casualties, it actually created a whole set of examples and a whole set of studies that were able to be conducted to really help propel the medical field in the field that many of us actually take for granted today. And so before we even kind of get into some of these different successes that you would find in some of the hospitals over the course of the American Civil War, you need to know a little bit about each of the medical departments and how they kind of operated a little bit before we can get into how they actually learned from this. And so at the beginning of the Civil War, you had both the Confederate Medical Department and the Union Medical Department, who did have the supplies, the medical personnel, the documentation records, such as the inventories, death records, that should have really all been used over the course of the Civil War. However, you start to see a difference in the way that these medical departments progress over the course of the Civil War, because throughout the South, you have much harder time getting supplies. You had a much harder time to be able to, in a sense, catch up and to really kind of maintain these soldiers who are being wounded and who are getting sick in these hospitals. And because the Southern Medical Department had a much harder time with the staff and acquiring supplies, they didn't really have as much of the ability to focus on the medical advancement that you would see the Northern Medical Department really kind of take hold of over the course of the American Civil War. And it's really kind of taken a hold of by the Union Medical Department that would eventually result in my favorite primary resource that resulted of the war, which is the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. And so it's nearly impossible to read all of these books word for word, one by one, because it's a collection of about 20 years of documentation and of records that were all collected from Union soldiers, or excuse me, Union surgeons throughout the war and submitted to Washington. And they really resulted from this gentleman here, Dr. William Alexander Hammond. who passed 2 circulars over the course of the Civil War. He passed circular number 2 on May 21st, 1862, and circular number 5 on June 9th of 1862. And these two medical circulars actually directed the Union medical officers to not only collect, but document cases and specimens of wounds, of diseases, of anything that might be of note, and send it to Washington so that it can be collected and that it can be put into all of these different records. And as a result of these circulars, it created an incentive for Union medical personnel, for surgeons, both civilian and military, who wanted to get involved in these circulars and have their work published. And so over the course of the war, for example, one surgeon who is a civilian doctor, Dr. Jacob DaCosta, was actually treating ill soldiers in Philadelphia, and he actually would collect his specimens and collect his studies of different ways to diagnose disease and sent it to Washington. Dr. Samuel Gross, who's the chair of surgery at Jefferson Medical College, was actually able to use the circular to study diseases on the soldiers in camps. And so circular number 2 created the incentive for these surgeons to actually collect and send in their specimens. And circular number 5 effectively would create the Army Medical Museum. But to kind of give you an example, this is just one of the cases that you can see here within the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. Case 1542, Private R.C. Hill, Company 1, 57th Pennsylvania. You can see he's just got a simple drawing, a simple wound on his arm. But as you go throughout this documentation, you'll be able to see varying wounds, varying degrees, diseases such as gangrene, the effects of dysentery, the effects of amputation, facial reconstructive surgery, things of that nature that is all documented here throughout these several volumes. Now, I will say you do have to have a strong stomach to go through some of these. The drawings in them can be a little bit graphic at times, but even more graphic, well, there's one, the gangrene that you would see in the arm. But it also actually created the Army Medical Museum, now the National Museum of Health and Medicine in just north of Washington, D.C. And so with all of these specimens that were collected, they were actually asked to put these specimens in alcohol in barrels and ship them to Washington, where they could be cataloged, where they could be put into glass jars and be used and be available for study and on display. You can actually go and see some of these specimens still today at the museum. And so by the end of the Civil War, you had thousands and thousands of these reports that were sent into the Army Medical Museum that then all had to be cataloged and then put on display. This is an image of the old Army Medical Museum that was just right in downtown Washington, D.C. And then the next slide here is of the new National Museum of Health and Medicine that's just north of Washington, D.C., to which you can actually see some of the examples of the wax figures as well as the bones and as the what we call soft specimens that are actually available and on display still for study. But it took several years for the Army Medical Department to actually go through and catalog and edit and to bind all of these different studies. And so they were actually published by the government printing office over the course of several years between 1870 and 1888 in different volumes. And so imagine having to wait years, about 18 years actually, for all of these cases and for all of these studies to be published and available for use. Whereas historians today, if we're interested in learning or in exploring any of these cases, we can actually go look at all of these resources that are actually all online. You can actually go to archive.com, or if you just Google them, they're actually online digitally today. And so over the course of the Civil War, you actually have From these cases and from these mistakes being made, and from all of these soldiers who are wounded and dying, the medical field is able to make many advancements, one of which you see here, which you may not be able to exactly recognize what this might be used for. However, what you see there in the screen is horsehair. And horsehair was actually used at one point in time to help suture wounds when they were finished with operations. And typically, the medical field wanted the surgeons to use metal or to use silk. That had been wrapped and sent and shipped to all of these field hospitals, to all of these general hospitals, but especially in the field hospitals, when these supplies became so rare and so quickly used, surgeons had to think on their feet and try to find new materials to use. And one of the materials that was easily available for surgeons to use to help suture the wounds was horsehair. You had plenty of horses available nearby in many cases. However, horsehair is very stiff, it's very coarse, and so surgeons actually started having that horsehair boiled to make it softer, make it easier to work with. But they started to make a connection. For the surgeons, for those surgeries that used horsehair, there was a less rate of infection than the surgeries that didn't use the horsehair. And why was that? It eventually started to make the connection that they boiled the horsehair, and boiling it must have done something. It sterilized it. And so this is just one example how over the course of the Civil War, new discoveries were made. And in this case, it was the discovery of sterilization and of boiling things and killing germs. In addition to this, another advancement that you would see over the course of the Civil War that many of us take for granted today is reconstructive surgery. And so efforts have been around since the 1830s to help and reconstruct facial wounds. However, they were not really quite that successful, and it made the life for the soldier or the person who had been wounded incredibly difficult or incredibly painful after their operation. And so one of the most well-known cases of this is actually this soldier here, who is Private Roland Ward, who is actually treated on by a man named Dr. Gurdon Book of New York. And so the case study for it that's actually listed in the medical and surgical history of the War of Rebellion actually says a fistula orifice 1/4 of an inch in diameter, only remaining in consequence of the constant secretion of saliva. He is able to articulate quite plainly, to which he has had hitherto been unable to do since the date of his injury. Until the completion of his operation, the patient was compelled to assume a recumbent position to receive his nourishment, or even swallow a glass of water. He can now take his food and drink without any difficulty and in an erect posture by the use of a rubber button. Properly adjusted to fit the fistulous orifice, the secretion of saliva was prevented from making its exit externally. The appearance of the patient both before and after the operation is shown by the photographs, numbers 167, 168, 169, 170, and 186. And so you can see the progression of his surgeries over the course of the years following his operations. And so you can see, even just from these images here, that his quality of life just increased and dramatically improved from not even being able to, much less speak, but eat or drink sitting up, to being able to have almost the full use of his mouth again. And so you would find this not only in dramatic instances such as this, such as reconstructive surgery, but in prosthetic limbs as well. And so amputations were actually one of the most common procedures that would actually take place over the course of the Civil War. Historians estimate that there were an average about 60,000 amputations over the 4 years. And there were prosthetics available prior to the American Civil War. However, they were very uncomfortable. They lacked mobility. And it made the fact that these soldiers, or that these civilians who were in an accident and had an amputation, it really made them a pariah, for, if you will, in society. Having an amputation back in the 19th century was, in a sense, a really big deal, because for a lot of these men who were a lot of the times farmers working in factories, they were the ones who were essentially providing for the family, could no longer provide for the family. They can no longer work in these fields. They could no longer work in the factories, and they would have to rely on others to help them and their family survive. And this, in a sense, took away their manhood. It took away their independence. And so it really had a negative impact, not only on their physical ability to live, but their mental ability to live as well. And so for a lot of these soldiers who underwent amputations, many of these soldiers actually remarked that they would rather die out in the field in the glory of battle than come home half a man to rely on someone else. And so the prosthetics that were available at the time didn't really help with that stigma. They really didn't help these men get back to their daily lives and be a meaningful part of society after the Civil War. And so you had someone who actually wanted to go and change all of that. And that man was named James Hanger. You all might recognize that from Hanger Prosthetics, because it's one of the leading companies in prosthetics today. And Private James Hanger, he was actually one of the first people to undergo an amputation over the course of the Civil War. He was wounded during the Battle of Philippi in June 3rd, 1861, even before the Battle of First Manassas, in a smaller skirmish. And he had to have his leg amputated. And all of the prosthetics that the government tried to give him were uncomfortable, they were painful, and they really limited his mobility. And so he actually started to invent his own prosthetics that were more comfortable for him to use and really allowed him greater mobility, and again, become a greater part of society again. And so he created what was known as the hanger limb, which is essentially the prosthetic limbs that you see here that have joints in them, that provide for mobility, that allow for flexibility. And so he actually started to create his own company of prosthetics even during the course of the Civil War. Already as early as 1863, he started to distribute some of his hanger limbs to other soldiers who were wounded from here in Virginia. And his business continued to expand throughout the 1870s. He got several patents from the US government. He was able to expand his company into several different states and several different cities, such as St. Louis and Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C., and eventually to Baltimore and Atlanta as well. And in 1906, he actually officially incorporated his company, the J.E. Hanger Company. And like I said, even though he passed away in 1919, Hanger Prosthetics is actually one of the leading companies for prosthetics still today. And it's all a result of the American Civil War. And it's all a result of what he and several of these other soldiers had to go through over the course of these 4 years of war. And so in just 4 short years, you have over 500,000 people who are wounded, who are killed. And especially throughout the South, for example, that ratio is about 3 of every 5 men. So 3 out of every 5 men throughout the South would die as a result of the Civil War. And the impacts of the war would last for years to come. Soldiers would continue to get infections from old wounds. Soldiers were never fully able to recover from various diseases and get their full health back again. And so even in the years following the Civil War, the numbers of the deaths as a result of these 4 years would only increase. And so here in the Civil War, this really propels the amount of soldiers who are getting sick, who are getting wounded, that that provides the medical personnel throughout the North and the South to study, to make mistakes, to learn, and really propel the medical field into the way that many of us take for granted today. For example, amputations are still a big deal for individuals emotionally and physically, but now prosthetics, there are people with prosthetics who can run marathons. You have people who break legs. I broke my leg 2 years ago out west, ironically, and if I had broken my leg 200 years ago, I probably would have gotten an infection and died out in the middle of the mountains. But because of the modern medical field and medicines, I was able to combat infections. People are able to overcome different diseases and live a lot longer today than those who lived 200 years ago. And so the next time that you get sick, or the next time that you hurt yourself and get a splinter, think about that and reflect on that, because it's not quite as big a deal as it is for us today as it was 200 years ago. All right, does anyone have any questions?
Awesome,
and just
Paige.
to kind of, I forgot to mention one little side, Chris, this is James' hanger, and this is just one example of his hanger limb.
And they also had a place in Pittsburgh, thank you, my hometown. They also had one of his shops. So yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Paige. We do have a few questions. So some of it you answered all on the way, but we'll kick a few things over to you. So first question, did Confederate surgeons or U.S. surgeons have to attend to their men first, or vice versa? And what medical breakthroughs were established during the Civil War? That was asked a few times, but I think you answered that pretty thoroughly. If there's anything else you want to tip in.
Yeah, so you see at the beginning of the war, for example, First Manassas, and I actually live in Northern Virginia, very close to First Manassas, so I've done a lot of research about the hospitals in First Manassas, but that's really where you see some of the strongest divides between North and South. In many cases, the hospitals, especially the field hospitals, would follow those battle lines, and you do have some soldiers that are in a sense, being taken to Union hospitals if they're Confederate soldiers and vice versa. But from all of the examples that I found at First Manassas, it's not so much as a requirement from the medical field. For example, it's not a directive that says you have to treat your soldiers first before treating soldiers of the enemy army. It's more of a mental and emotional state. If a surgeon from the Confederate Army comes across a Union soldier in 1861, there's such hatred for either side that a lot of the times they're just left until all of the other soldiers from their side are treated first. So it's not quite as much of a medical directive, but that's where you start to see those surgeons that are taken as prisoners of war and are directly taken away. They just didn't think about the fight for life or death. And that's why you have that directive that comes in 1862 that essentially makes medical personnel neutral. So if any medical personnel is captured by the enemy, they will essentially be released or exchanged for an equal part of medical personnel. And so that effectively allows soldiers to be able to, or excuse me, surgeons to be able to, like I said, be neutral. Now, you do have cases over the course of the war where you still have a chagrin, or you still have that mental feeling that you might not necessarily want to treat a soldier who you would consider to be the enemy. But after 1862, it really does become neutral. And if there's a patient in your hospital, they need to do whatever they can to try and save that soldier's life, no matter what side they're from.
Yeah, and there's a lot of instances out on the battlefields, especially after a battle, that Union and Confederate surgeons are working side by side. Salem Church, talked about that earlier today in my Fredericksburg talk, but that's a field hospital in the midst of the Battle of Salem Church in May of 1863 and Chancellorsville campaign. And, David Holt, who's a Union surgeon, is writing. He's talking with Mary Todd Lincoln's brother, who's a surgeon, and they're working side by side and talking about, a lot of different interactions. It's pretty interesting. Another question, Paige: were Black soldiers discriminated against in terms of preferential medical treatment to white soldiers?
So in the field hospitals, again, because of that directive, I haven't found any cases, personally speaking. You might have been able to, Chris, whatever you came across in some of your research, that they actually effectively left Union soldier, or excuse me, Black soldiers to essentially just die from neglect. However, I will say in some of the hospitals, and more so of the general hospitals, you do have all those hospitals that are segregated. So for example, in Alexandria, the Union hospitals that are overtaking the town very early on in the war, you do have segregated hospitals between those for white patients as well as those for African-American patients. And most of the nurses and most of the medical personnel working there in those hospitals, with the exception of maybe the head surgeon and the assistant surgeon, were all African American. And in many cases, especially in Alexandria, they may be contrabands, or they may be people who were previously enslaved who had fled to Alexandria for freedom.
Yeah, I don't see anything that's like outright they wouldn't treat them or anything like that. Whenever the soldiers were brought in for treatment, I haven't seen that in my mind of things. And I've looked at recently. We've been doing a lot of research on that. Let's see. Question: were soldiers' families told the cause of death? If a soldier died in camp of dysentery, was his family told that, or were they simply told that he died and an approximate date of death?
So it really all varied based on the location and the circumstances of where these soldiers unfortunately died, especially in cases, for example, like First Manassas and Gettysburg, where they are so overwhelmed and so inundated with wounded and sick patients. Sometimes the record keeping just was not there. And so you actually have several cases of one example, for example, in the hospitals of First Manassas, you have a patient who is alive and well, who is actually working in the hospitals, who missed roll call a couple of times because he was busy, and his name was sent in the newspapers back home that he had passed away. For some of the different medical records that you have kept here in these hospitals, if they were even kept at all, if there was a date of death and if there was a cause of death, 9 times out of 10, it would just purely state gunshot wound in Latin, or it might say the name of the disease. But those records were oftentimes sent to either, for example, Washington, D.C. for the Union Army, where some of them are still housed today, or for the Confederate Army, some of those were sent down to Richmond to the business district, which actually burned in 1865. And so some of those records, especially for the Confederate soldiers, were just lost. And so it really all kind of depended. I can't give you a clear answer on the situation and just the availability of these records, but they're not quite as up to date, and they were not quite as specific as historians would like them to be. Some of the most specific records that we do have of soldiers who die out on the field or who die from a disease actually don't come from those medical records from the military. They actually come from letters of friends or family who were near the person who had passed away when they died and was able to get that word home to them. But it didn't quite so much come from the government or come from the newspapers.
Yeah, and you go, and then you have the whole studies that have come out in the last 20 years about, the clean death. People don't really talk about it or things like that. So
the good death.
Yeah, the good death. So you're absolutely right, Paige. If those letters are gold to us a lot of times. And I think the other thing for wounded soldiers are the pension records. Those are fantastic. Sometimes you get very detailed about when, how, and where they were shot out on the battlefield. Let's see, we have just a couple more before we let you go. Let's see, to prevent transmission of diseases, was inoculation against smallpox or other things used on either side or by either side during the Civil War?
So you did have some cases of inoculations actually taking place in areas where diseases were very widespread. However, at this point in time, it's not quite as much as we would nearly like to see. And there are even actually some cases over the course of the Civil War, particularly at the beginning, where they're still using very outdated methods of quote unquote inoculation. For example, if a soldier was in a hospital and their wound was oozing pus, for example, that was sometimes considered laudable pus. pus or good pus. So they would actually take that from one patient and transfer it to another patient, thinking that they were spreading the healing, when in fact they were actually spreading infections throughout these hospitals. And so you did have a couple of different versions of inoculation, some of which were helpful and some of which were not quite so much.
Because we're still about 10 years away from the germ theory being accepted at this point, right?
Yeah, and that was really a result of some of these mistakes, such as the horsehair, over the course of the Civil War, where they started putting 2 and 2 together with sterilization.
Yeah, sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart. So let's see. Have you a comment on the Chisholm inhaler developed by a physician in the service of the Confederates?
So I will be completely honest with you. I actually haven't done that much research on that yet.
Yeah, I have no idea. Let's see here. And then
I'm going to have to take note of that so that I can add that in my presentations.
Yeah, this is how you always learn. It's
I know,
always, you're prepared
exactly.
for the questions that you want to get, but you're never prepared for the questions you actually get. I know how that is as a presenter. Let's see, were there any states that budgeted money post-war to care for soldiers? I believe Mississippi budgeted 20% towards prosthetics for amputees. By today's standards, we know how expensive it is because they have lost their leg. I could not imagine the cost at the time with little to no income.
Yeah, and that's really where the pension office really comes into play, because you do have several states that are, and even the national governments that are providing pensions to these soldiers who were wounded and to their families. You do have several cases of people who are applying for funds, especially for amputees who aren't able to work. And so, I mean, quite honestly, that's a whole other presentation in itself. And there's a ton of research out there that's available on the American Battlefield Trust, but also the National Museum of Health and Medicine, as well as the Civil War Medical Museum up in Frederick, Maryland, that has a ton of research on that you'll be able to look up.
Yeah, if you haven't been out to Frederick, that's well worth the trip to head out there and see the National Civil War Medical Museum. I always get the name wrong, but it's in Frederick. It's a fantastic it's a fantastic museum, and there are soldiers after the war or during the war who will lose both their hands, but then go on to full careers later on. Thomas Plunkett, who's a Medal of Honor recipient from Fredericksburg, loses both of his hands and then goes on to have a large family. There's one guy who becomes a farmer who lost both of his arms and has like 9 kids. So it's amazing what these guys go on to do afterwards, and to see what they do. And some of these doctors like Jonathan Letterman and Hunter Holmes McGuire are some of the leading medical minds in the United States. So with that, Paige, we're going to let you go. We hope you have a safe flight tomorrow. And I want to thank you for a great presentation this evening. And I want to thank everybody for watching tonight. Please head over to battlefields.org and check out all of the great content that we have. Some of it has been produced by Paige. Learn more about the Civil War era and its medical treatment